Behind the golden gates of Ravencrest Palace, where centuries of tradition mask deadly secrets, Crown Prince Alexander was about to discover that some betrayals cut deeper than any sword. When the royal guard stumbled upon evidence that would shatter the very foundation of the monarchy, a father's protective fury would unleash consequences that no crown could contain. In a world where loyalty is currency and blood determines destiny, one shocking revelation would prove that even kings can fall when family honor is at stake. The morning mist clung to Ravencrest Palace like a shroud, but Crown Prince Alexander felt none of its chill as he strode through the marble corridors. At 42, he carried himself with the confident bearing of a man destined for the throne, his steel-grey eyes reflecting both the weight of future kingship and the fierce protectiveness of a devoted father. Today, however, something felt different in the ancient halls, where his ancestors had ruled for 8 centuries. Captain Marcus Thornfield of the Royal Guard appeared around the corner, his usually composed face etched with an expression Alexander had never seen before. The seasoned soldier's hands trembled slightly as he clutched a manila envelope, and his weathered features seemed to have aged a decade overnight. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus began, his voice hoarse with what sounded like a mixture of duty and dread. "We need to speak privately." Immediately. Alexander studied the man who had served his family faithfully for 25 years. Marcus had been present at his wedding to Princess Isabella, had stood guard during the birth of their twin sons, and had never once faltered in his loyalty. The fact that he looked ready to collapse spoke volumes about whatever he had discovered. "My study?" Alexander commanded, leading the way to his private chambers. The oak-paneled room, lined with leather-bound books and portraits of long-dead monarchs, had always been his sanctuary. Today, it would become the place where his world began to crumble. Marcus closed the heavy door behind them and activated the electronic privacy measures that would ensure their conversation remained completely confidential. The soft hum of the jamming devices filled the silence as the captain struggled to find his words. "Sir, last night we conducted our routine security sweep of the Queen Mother's private quarters," Marcus began, referencing Alexander's stepmother, Queen Dowager Victoria, who had married his father 15 years ago. "During our inspection, we discovered something hidden in her son Edward's personal effects. Edward Blackwood was 28 years old, Victoria's son from her first marriage, and officially held no title or position within the royal household. However, he had been granted residence at the palace and enjoyed certain privileges as the Queen Mother's child. Alexander had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship with his stepbrother, viewing him as harmless if somewhat entitled." "What did you find?" Alexander asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer would change everything. Marcus opened the envelope with hands that betrayed his military training. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be correspondence. As he laid them out on Alexander's mahogany desk, the Crown Prince felt his blood begin to boil. The first photograph showed his 15-year-old son, Prince James, in his school uniform, apparently taken without the boy's knowledge from a considerable distance. The image was part of a series that documented James's daily routine with disturbing precision, his route to classes, his favorite spots in the palace gardens, even the times when he was most vulnerable and alone. "There are dozens of these," Marcus said quietly, dating back several months. "But that's not the worst of it." The documents revealed a level of planning that chilled Alexander to his core. Edward had compiled detailed schedules of both his sons, Prince James and Prince William, noting their security details, their personal habits, and most alarmingly, the gaps in their protection. It read like a predator's handbook, methodical and cold. But it was the correspondence that truly ignited Alexander's fury. Letters and printed emails between Edward and unknown parties discussed the princes in terms that made Alexander's vision blur with rage. The communication spoke of opportunities, access and arrangements in language that left little doubt about Edward's intentions toward the royal children. "Sir, there's more," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We found evidence that he's been in contact with certain individuals who have expressed interest in gaining access to the princes. The communications suggest that Edward was planning to facilitate these meetings in exchange for substantial financial compensation." Alexander's hands clenched into fists as he processed the full scope of what his stepbrother had been planning. The man he had allowed into his home, into his family's most private spaces, had been stalking his children and apparently preparing to expose them to unthinkable dangers. "Where is Edward now?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "He left the palace early this morning before we made this discovery. We believe he may have become aware that his room was being searched." Marcus replied. Your Highness, there's something else. The financial records we found suggest that Queen Mother Victoria may have been aware of at least some of these activities. The implication hit Alexander like a physical blow. His stepmother, whom he had treated with respect and courtesy for 15 years, might have known that her son was stalking his children and done nothing to stop it. Worse, she might have been complicit in whatever Edward had been planning. Alexander walked to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, where he could see his younger son William practicing archery with his instructor. The boy's dark hair caught the morning sunlight, and his concentrated expression reminded Alexander so much of himself at that age. The thought that someone had been watching his children, planning to harm them, filled him with a protective rage that threatened to consume his rational thought. Captain Thornfield, Alexander said without turning from the window, I want Edward found and brought back to the palace immediately. I want a complete investigation into Queen Mother Victoria's knowledge of these activities. I want every person Edward has been in contact with identified and investigated. And I want this done quietly, without alerting the press or causing a public scandal that would traumatize my sons. Yes, Your Royal Highness. What are your instructions regarding the Queen Mother? Alexander turned back to face the captain, and Marcus involuntarily stepped back at the cold fury he saw in the Crown Prince's eyes. I will handle Victoria personally, but first I need to ensure my children's safety. Double their security details immediately, but do it subtly. They shouldn't feel like prisoners in their own home because of Edward's sick obsession. As Marcus gathered the evidence and prepared to leave, Alexander called out to him. Captain, how long have you known about this? We discovered it late last night, sir. I came to you as soon as I could verify the authenticity of the materials. I wanted to be certain before making such serious accusations. Alexander nodded, appreciating the man's thoroughness even in his current state of fury. You did right to come to me immediately. This information goes no further until I decide how to proceed. After Marcus left, Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the evidence of Edward's betrayal. His hand shook as he thought about all the times Edward had been present at family gatherings, all the innocent interactions he had witnessed between his stepbrother and his sons. Had Edward been studying them even then? Had he been planning this violation of their safety and innocence for months or even years? The sound of laughter from the gardens drew his attention back to the window. Both of his sons were now outside, engaged in what appeared to be a spirited debate with their tutor about some aspect of their history lesson. They looked so young, so trusting, so completely unaware that someone had been watching them with malicious intent. Alexander made his decision. Edward would face the consequences of his actions, but first, he needed to confront Victoria. If she had known about her son's activities and done nothing to protect his children, she would learn exactly what happened when someone threatened the Crown Prince's family. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he had never thought he would need to use for a family matter. This is Alexander. I need a complete security assessment of all palace residents and staff. Yes, including family members. I'll explain everything when you arrive. As he waited for his security team to arrive, Alexander looked once more at the photographs of his son James. The boy's innocent smile in the candid shots stood in stark contrast to the malicious intent behind their capture. Someone would pay for this violation of his children's safety and innocence. Someone would learn that a father's protective fury was not something to be underestimated. The morning mist had lifted from the palace grounds, but Alexander felt as though a much darker cloud was just beginning to settle over his family. Whatever came next, he would make sure that his children were protected, even if it meant destroying relationships that had taken years to build. The war for his family's safety was about to begin, and Alexander was prepared to fight it with every resource at his disposal. The confrontation Alexander had been dreading could no longer be postponed. Queen Mother Victoria sat in her private sitting room, surrounded by the antique furniture and family portraits that had always made her feel secure in her position within the royal family. At 58, she maintained the regal bearing that had first attracted Alexander's father, but today her carefully composed facade would be tested as never before. Alexander entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately set Victoria on edge. Behind him came Captain Thornfield, carrying the damning evidence that would shatter whatever remained of their family relationship. The Crown Prince's face was a mask of controlled fury, and Victoria instinctively knew that whatever brought him here was serious enough to threaten her very position in the palace. Alexander, what's the meaning of this intrusion? Victoria demanded, rising from her velvet armchair with all the dignity she could muster. I was not aware we had an appointment. Sit down, Victoria, Alexander commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. We need to discuss your son's recent activities. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers betrayed a slight tremor as she lowered herself back into the chair. Edward? What about Edward? He's been quite busy with his charitable work lately. I'm sure whatever minor issue has arisen can be resolved easily. Captain Thornfield placed the manila envelope on the ornate coffee table between them, and Alexander watched Victoria's face carefully for any sign of recognition. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. Her eyes darted to the envelope and then away. Too quickly, too nervously. She knew something. Open it, Alexander ordered. Victoria's hands shook slightly as she reached for the envelope. As the photograph spilled out onto the table, her face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She stared at the images of Prince James and Prince William, her lips moving silently, as if she were trying to form words that wouldn't come. How long have you known? Alexander asked, his voice deadly quiet. I don't know what you mean, Victoria whispered, but her denial lacked any conviction. This is clearly some sort of mistake. Edward would never. Don't lie to me, Alexander interrupted, slamming his hand down on the table with enough force to make Victoria jump. These photographs were found in Edward's room, along with detailed plans about my children's routines and correspondence with individuals whose identities we are currently investigating. You will tell me right now what you know about this. Victoria looked around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. For 15 years, she had enjoyed the security and prestige of being the Queen Mother. But she had always known that her position depended entirely on Alexander's goodwill. That goodwill was now hanging by the thinnest of threads. He needed money, Victoria admitted finally, her voice barely audible. Edward has had some financial difficulties, gambling debts, poor investments. He came to me several months ago, desperate for help. Alexander felt his fury reach a new level. And your solution was to let him sell access to my children? No, Victoria protested, though her voice lacked conviction. It wasn't supposed to be like that. He said he had met some people who were interested in royal memorabilia, people who would pay well for authentic items from the palace. I thought he was talking about selling some of his personal possessions, things he had acquired over the years. Personal possessions? Alexander repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. Is that what you call photographs of my 15-year-old son taken without his knowledge or consent? Captain Thornfield cleared his throat. Your Royal Highness, perhaps I should mention that we found evidence of several large financial transactions into accounts controlled by both Edward and Queen Mother Victoria over the past 6 months. The amounts are substantial enough to suggest that whatever was being offered for sale was considerably more valuable than personal memorabilia. Victoria's face crumpled as she realized that the financial evidence would be impossible to explain away. I never asked for details, she said desperately. Edward told me he was handling everything, that it was all perfectly legal and harmless. I needed the money too, Alexander. Do you have any idea what it cost to maintain the lifestyle expected of a queen mother on the allowance your father left me? Alexander stared at the woman who had once been like a mother to him, trying to reconcile the caring stepmother he remembered with the person who had just admitted to profiting from what appeared to be a scheme targeting his children. So you knowingly participated in Edward's activities without bothering to find out what he was actually selling? You accepted money without questioning where it came from or what he was doing to earn it? I thought it was harmless, Victoria repeated, tears beginning to streak down her cheeks. Rich collectors pay enormous amounts for royal artifacts. I thought Edward had found some items that people wanted to buy. I never imagined he was taking photographs of the children or making contact with strangers about them. Alexander pulled out his phone and showed Victoria one of the intercepted communications that Captain Thornfield had discovered. Read this message that Edward sent to one of his contacts 3 weeks ago. Victoria's face went white as she read Edward's description of Prince James' daily routine and his assessment of when the boy was most accessible. The language was clinical, predatory, and left no doubt about the true nature of what Edward had been offering to sell. My God, Victoria whispered. I had no idea he was writing things like this. Alexander, you have to believe me. I never would have allowed this if I had known what he was really doing. But you suspected something, didn't you? Alexander pressed. You knew Edward was involved in something questionable, and you chose to ignore your instincts because the money was too tempting. Victoria's silence was answer enough. Alexander could see in her expression that she had indeed suspected that Edward's sudden financial recovery was not entirely legitimate, but she had chosen willful ignorance over investigating further. Where is Edward now? Alexander demanded. I don't know, Victoria admitted. He left very early this morning, before dawn. He said he had business to attend to and would be gone for several days. I assumed it was related to his work. Captain Thornfield stepped forward. Your Royal Highness, we've been monitoring Edward's communications since we discovered this evidence. His last known location was approximately 50 miles from the palace, but he appears to have turned off his phone and is no longer responding to messages from his contacts. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. If Edward had discovered that his activities had been exposed, he might be desperate enough to do something reckless. The thought of his unstable stepbrother on the loose, potentially with knowledge that could harm his family, was terrifying. Victoria, you're going to help us find him, Alexander ordered. You're going to contact everyone Edward knows, every friend, every business associate, every person he might turn to for help. You're going to use whatever influence you have left to bring him back here, so we can deal with this situation properly. And if I refuse? Victoria asked, though they both knew she had no real choice. Alexander's expression hardened. Then you'll find yourself in the same position as Edward when this investigation is complete. You participated in a scheme that put my children at risk, Victoria. You accepted money that came from exploiting their safety and privacy. The only question now is whether you're going to help fix this mess or whether you're going to be treated as an equal participant in it. Victoria looked around her luxurious sitting room one more time, perhaps realizing that she might never see it again if she chose the wrong response. What do you want me to do? Start making phone calls, Alexander commanded. And Victoria, if I discover that you've warned Edward or helped him escape in any way, I will personally ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions. My children's safety is worth more to me than any family relationship. As Victoria reached for her phone with trembling hands, Alexander wondered how their family had come to this point. The woman he had once respected and cared for had betrayed his trust in the most fundamental way possible, and her son had threatened the safety of his children for money. The bonds of family that had once seemed unbreakable now lay in ruins around them. But Alexander's resolve had never been clearer. He would find Edward, he would uncover everyone involved in the scheme, and he would ensure that nothing like this ever threatened his children again. The fury that burned in his chest was no longer just anger at the betrayal, but a father's implacable determination to protect his family at any cost. The palace had transformed into a fortress of activity by evening. Security personnel moved through the corridors with quiet efficiency, while Alexander coordinated the search for Edward from his private study. Multiple phone lines buzzed with updates from investigators, and computer screens displayed real-time tracking information as the royal security apparatus focused its considerable resources on finding one missing man. Prince James and Prince William had been quietly relocated to the palace's most secure wing under the pretense of routine maintenance in their usual quarters. Alexander had explained the move as temporary, watching his sons' faces carefully for any sign that they suspected something more serious was happening. So far, they seemed to accept his explanation. Though 15-year-old James had asked several pointed questions about why their security detail had suddenly doubled. Princess Isabella, Alexander's wife of 18 years, stood by the window watching their sons practice fencing in the secure courtyard below. Her usually calm demeanor showed cracks of strain as she processed what Alexander had revealed about Edward's activities. "How could we have missed this?" Isabella asked, her voice tight with worry. "Edward has been in our home, at our dinner table, around our children for years. How did we not see what he was capable of?" Alexander looked up from the intelligence reports scattered across his desk. "Because we trusted family. Because we assumed that Victoria's son was harmless. Because we never imagined that someone we considered family would be capable of something like this." "The boys are asking questions," Isabella continued. "James especially. He knows something serious is happening, and he's starting to piece things together. How much longer can we keep them in the dark?" "Until Edward is found and this situation is resolved," Alexander replied firmly. "I won't have my children living in fear because of Edward's sick obsession." Captain Thornfield entered the study with his afternoon report. "Your Royal Highness, we've had some developments. Victoria's phone calls led us to a friend of Edward's who admits to seeing him yesterday evening. According to this individual, Edward appeared agitated and mentioned something about finalizing arrangements before leaving the country." Alexander felt his blood pressure spike. "Leaving the country? What arrangements?" "We're not certain, but our financial investigators have discovered that Edward withdrew a substantial amount of cash from multiple accounts over the past week. Enough to fund an extended disappearance, or alternatively, Enough to pay someone for services rendered. The implications chilled Alexander. If Edward was planning to leave the country, it suggested he knew his activities had been discovered. But the reference to finalizing arrangements raised the terrifying possibility that he might attempt to complete whatever transaction he had been planning before disappearing. "Sir, there's more," Captain Thornfield continued. "We've identified two of the individuals Edward was corresponding with. One has a criminal history involving exploitation of minors. The other appears to be connected to an international network that we've been monitoring for several years." Alexander's worst fears were being confirmed. Edward hadn't just been taking photographs for money, he had been making contact with dangerous individuals who posed a genuine threat to his children's safety. Have either of these individuals been apprehended? We're coordinating with law enforcement agencies, but both individuals appear to have gone to ground around the same time Edward disappeared. We believe they may have been warned. Isabella moved away from the window, her face pale. "Alexander, if these people know where we are, if they know the children's routines, we need to consider relocating the family entirely until this is resolved."
Alexander considered his wife's suggestion.
The palace had been his family's home for generations, and the idea of being driven from it by Edward's betrayal filled him with rage. But his children's safety had to take priority over pride or tradition. "Your Royal Highness," a new voice interrupted from the doorway. Detective Inspector Sarah Martinez from the Metropolitan Police stood waiting for permission to enter. She had arrived 3 hours earlier to coordinate the law enforcement response to what had become a potential international security threat.
"Inspector, what have you found?" Detective Inspector Martinez entered the study carrying a tablet computer.
"We've been analyzing Edward's digital communications, and we've uncovered evidence of a much larger operation than we initially suspected. Edward appears to have been part of a network that targets the children of high-profile families." She handed the tablet to Alexander, who scrolled through screenshots of encrypted communications between Edward and multiple unknown parties. The messages discussed packages, delivery schedules, and client specifications in language that was clearly code for something sinister. "How many other families have been targeted?" Isabella asked, reading over Alexander's shoulder. "We've identified at least 6 other cases over the past 2 years. Detective Inspector Martinez replied. "Children of politicians, business leaders, and celebrities. In each case, someone with access to the family provided detailed intelligence about the children's routines and vulnerabilities." Alexander felt sick as the full scope of what Edward had been involved in became clear. This wasn't just a desperate man making poor choices for money. This was an organized criminal operation that specifically targeted children, and Edward had been trying to deliver his own stepnephews to these predators. "Inspector, what's being done to protect the other families who may be at risk?" "We're working with international law enforcement to notify potential targets and coordinate protective measures. But right now, our priority is finding Edward and the individuals he's been working with before they can complete whatever they're planning." A secured phone line rang, and Captain Thornfield answered quickly. After a brief conversation, he turned to Alexander with urgent news. "Your Royal Highness, Edward has been spotted at a private airfield approximately 2 hours from here. He appears to be preparing to board a private aircraft, and he's not alone. There are at least 2 other individuals with him, and one matches the description of a person from our investigation." Alexander stood up immediately. "What's the status of our response team?" "Already en route, sir. But the aircraft they're planning to use is fueled and ready for departure. If they leave before our people arrive, we may lose them entirely." Alexander's mind raced through the possibilities. If Edward escaped with his co-conspirators, they would carry with them detailed knowledge about his children's routines and vulnerabilities. Even if they never returned to the country, that information could be sold to others or used to plan future operations.
"I want that aircraft grounded immediately," Alexander ordered.
"Contact air traffic control. Contact whoever you need to contact, but do not let that plane leave British airspace." "Sir, there may be complications if they're planning to claim diplomatic immunity or if the aircraft is registered in another country," Detective Inspector Martinez warned.
"I don't care about diplomatic complications," Alexander replied, his voice hard.
"My children's safety is more important than international relations. That plane stays on the ground until Edward and his associates are in custody." Isabella placed a hand on his arm. "Alexander, what if this is exactly what they want? What if they're using Edward's attempted escape to distract us from their real plan?" The possibility hit Alexander like a physical blow. What if Edward's obvious preparations to flee were meant to draw their attention away from an immediate threat? What if someone else was already moving against his children while they focused on the airfield? "Captain Thornfield, I want an immediate security check on both boys. Visual confirmation that they're safe and secure. Now, as Thornfield reached for his radio, alarms began sounding throughout the palace. Emergency lights flashed in the corridors, and the sound of running feet echoed from the hallways outside Alexander's study. Alexander's worst nightmare was beginning to unfold. While they had been tracking Edward's escape attempt, someone else had made their move against his family. The hunt for his children had begun, and Alexander realized with horror that he might already be too late to stop it. Isabella grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with terror. The boys. Where are the boys? Alexander was already moving toward the door, his protective fury now mixed with a parent's ultimate fear. Everything that mattered to him in the world was under threat, and he would stop at nothing to ensure his children's safety. The rescue operation launched with military precision as the clock showed 43 minutes until the kidnapper's deadline. Alexander stood in the mobile command center that had been established in the palace courtyard, watching multiple screens display real-time intelligence from across the country. The combined resources of the Metropolitan Police, military special forces, and international intelligence agencies had been mobilized for a single purpose: finding Prince James before it was too late. "We have a breakthrough," Detective Inspector Martinez announced, rushing to Alexander's position with critical intelligence. The signal analysis team managed to trace the ransom call to a general area about 30 miles northwest of here. It's a rural region with several abandoned industrial facilities that would provide perfect cover for this type of operation. Captain Thornfield pointed to a detailed map displayed on one of the main screens. "We've identified 3 primary locations where they could be holding Prince James. 2 old manufacturing plants and a decommissioned military communications facility. All 3 have been vacant for years and would offer the isolation they need." Alexander studied the tactical information while maintaining communication with the kidnappers to buy additional time. His second conversation with them had revealed professionals who were prepared for a sophisticated rescue attempt, but he was betting that they had underestimated the full scope of resources that would be deployed against them.
"What's the status of our teams?" Alexander asked.
3 specialized units are moving into position around each location, Thornfield reported. Advanced surveillance equipment is being deployed to confirm which facility is actually being used. We should have definitive intelligence within the next 15 minutes. A new voice interrupted from the communications station. "Your Royal Highness, we're receiving another transmission from the kidnappers." Alexander moved quickly to take the call, knowing that every interaction provided additional opportunities to gather intelligence about James's location and condition. Crown Prince Alexander, the same mechanically distorted voice began. "We hope you have used this time wisely to prepare our payment rather than wasting resources on futile rescue attempts. The money is being arranged," Alexander replied, signaling the technical team to continue their tracing efforts. "But I need proof that my son is alive and unharmed before any transfer takes place." "You are hardly in a position to make demands," the voice responded coldly. "However, we understand your paternal concerns." The line went quiet for a moment before a different voice came through the speakers. It was James, speaking hesitantly but clearly. "Father? I'm okay. They haven't hurt me, but I think they're serious about their threats. Please be careful." Alexander's relief at hearing his son's voice was immediately replaced by admiration for the boy's composure under terrifying circumstances. Even at 15, James was demonstrating the strength and intelligence that would serve him well as a future leader. "James, stay strong. We are going to get you home safely," Alexander said before the kidnappers cut the connection. "Sir, we got him," one of the technicians called out excitedly. "The extended transmission gave us enough data to pinpoint their exact location. They're at the old Blackwater Communications Facility, approximately 28 miles from here." Captain Thornfield was already coordinating with the tactical teams. Alpha and Bravo teams are redirecting to Blackwater. Charlie team will maintain surveillance on the other locations in case this is misdirection. We'll have eyes on the target in 8 minutes. Alexander felt the familiar mixture of hope and terror that came with knowing his son's location, but also understanding that the most dangerous part of this ordeal was just beginning. Rescue operations involving hostages were inherently risky, and one mistake could cost James his life. "Your Highness," Detective Inspector Martinez approached with additional intelligence. "We've confirmed that Edward is not at the Blackwater facility. Our team at the airfield reports that he's been found injured and appears to have been held against his will for several hours. He's conscious and providing information about the network's operations." Alexander processed this information quickly. If Edward had been coerced into participating rather than acting willingly, it changed the entire dynamic of the situation. It also meant that the criminal network had been operating independently of Edward's intelligence, which could make them more dangerous but also potentially less informed about palace security procedures. What is Edward telling us about these people? According to his initial statement, he was approached months ago by individuals who claimed to be legitimate collectors of royal memorabilia, Martinez replied. They gradually escalated their requests for information and photographs until he realized he was involved in something criminal. When he tried to back out, they threatened him and eventually forced his cooperation through blackmail and physical intimidation. The revelation partially explained how the network had gained access to detailed information about James's routines, but it also raised new questions about how they had managed to execute such a sophisticated operation inside the palace itself. Sir, we have visual confirmation, Captain Thornfield announced as images from the tactical team's reconnaissance equipment appeared on the main screens. Prince James is being held in the main building of the Blackwater facility. We count 4 individuals guarding him, consistent with our earlier intelligence estimates. Alexander watched the grainy surveillance footage that showed his son sitting in what appeared to be an office chair, apparently unharmed but clearly under guard. The kidnappers had positioned themselves strategically throughout the building, making a direct assault extremely dangerous. What are our options for getting him out safely? The building has multiple entry points, but the kidnappers have chosen their position well, Thornfield explained. They have clear sight lines to all approaches, and they've positioned Prince James in a location where any rescue attempt would put him at immediate risk. Alexander stared at the tactical display, weighing impossible choices. A frontal assault could rescue James quickly, but might result in his injury or death if the kidnappers decided to harm him rather than surrender. Negotiations might keep him safe longer, but would give the criminals more time to potentially escape or bring in reinforcements. Your Highness, the communications officer called out. The kidnappers are demanding immediate confirmation of the ransom payment. They're becoming impatient. Alexander made his decision with the cold calculation that had served his family for generations. Tell them the money is being transferred now and that we need 15 minutes to complete the banking procedures. Use that time to get our people into position for a coordinated rescue attempt. Sir, if the rescue fails, Thornfield began. It won't fail, Alexander interrupted with absolute conviction. These people made the mistake of threatening my son. They're about to learn exactly what that means. As the tactical teams moved into their final positions, Alexander maintained communication with the kidnappers while simultaneously coordinating one of the most complex rescue operations ever mounted by royal security. Every second brought them closer to either triumph or tragedy, and the weight of his son's life rested entirely on the decisions he made in the next few critical minutes. The confrontation that had begun with Edward's betrayal was about to reach its conclusion, and Alexander was determined that when it ended, his family would be whole again and the people who had threatened them would face the full consequences of their actions. The fury that had sustained him throughout this ordeal was about to be channeled into the precise, overwhelming force that would bring his son home safely. James was coming home, and nothing would stand in the way of that outcome. Through the command center speakers, Alexander heard the final countdown begin as his tactical teams reported ready status. In minutes, this nightmare would be over, and the people responsible for threatening his family would learn why the Crown Prince's protective fury was legendary among those who knew him best. The rescue was about to begin.